Today, in our tolerance-oriented culture, sincerity many times equals truth. But just because I'm sincere when I say 2 plus 2 is 5, does that make it true? See, 2 plus 2 does not equal 5. And someone can be sincere, but they can also be sincerely wrong. My mom is sincere when she thinks I have the best voice in the choir. But the truth is, Mom is wrong. All the sincerity in the world won't overrule truth. And people many times cling to their certainty about a belief, even though truth contradicts their sincere belief. The reason we do that is fear of failure is a powerful drug. See, being proved wrong means I've got to admit that I'm a failure. It takes a secure person to own up to their wrong, sometimes long-held belief. A fellow by the name of Phil Cook, he's a leadership consultant, writes an article about how to deal with someone who is sincere but sincerely wrong. He says this, and I quote, he says, "One of the greatest challenges you'll ever face in the workplace is confronting someone who is sincere but sincerely wrong. Their absolute belief in the rightness of what they're doing is what makes it so difficult to change their mind or offer correction." See, when it comes to our relationship with Jesus, the Bible exhorts us to share the gospel with those that do not know Christ. We are to speak the truth of God's word to others, and when we speak the truth, we're to speak it in love. Now, as a Christ follower, we need to understand the issue is truth. It's not sincerity. And fortunately, God gives us understanding to determine what is true. And Christian philosophers help us understand what is true must pass what I want to call the test for truth. Well, what do I mean by that? For something to be true, it must be verifiable. It has to be explainable. It must be undeniable. Let me give you an example. An atheist. An atheist sincerely believes that there is no God. They believe that man has evolved and man is all there is and ever will be. And when we die, we're just simply food for worms. But for atheism to be true, you have to conclude that nothing created something out of nothing. Well, that's silly, because nothing is nothing and can't create anything. And so therefore, an atheist cannot explain his origins. Therefore, his belief cannot be verified. Let me give you another example. There's a worldview called pantheism. It's another word for it is New Age, which is nothing new. It's been around since the time of Christ. There's this thinking that all the world is an illusion. The words that I'm saying, the benches that you're sitting on, all of it is an illusion. And all life forms are in a reincarnation cycle. One life form is a stepping stone to be reincarnated into a higher life form. So a lower life form, like let's say a cat, when it experiences enough good karma, it can be reincarnated into a higher life form, like a dog. A monkey, if it experiences enough karma. You guys got that about the dog and the cat? I got it. Okay. Took you a while, some of you. But a monkey, if it experiences enough good karma, will experience reincarnated. It'll be ratcheted up to a human. Then once a human experiences enough good karma, once they reach the top, then they're absorbed into what's called God consciousness. And that is described as nirvana. Now consider their fundamental belief. They say the world's an illusion and everything in it is an illusion. That means you can't even trust the ink that you are writing down your beliefs with. Therefore, this belief cannot be verified or explained. Therefore, it is false. But I want you to consider Christianity. God created the world and is intimately involved in his creation. Christianity, I believe, is verifiable in that the person of Jesus stated he was the Son of God. And men killed him for that claim. In his life, Jesus predicted he had to die to be the ultimate sacrifice for our sin. Jesus said his authenticity of his claims will be verified when he rises from the grave. Well, 2 professional executioners signed his death certificate. A 2-ton stone was rolled over the opening of his tomb. A Roman guard was placed around his tomb. 12 to 16 trained Roman soldiers, a Roman seal that said nobody tampers with this. But just like Jesus said, the tomb was empty. He appears to Peter, he appears to the apostles, he appears to a crowd of over 400 over a 40-day period of time. C.S. Lewis keenly observed that Jesus, since he claimed to be Lord, there's only 3 possibilities open to him. He's either the Lord, he is who he says he was, or he's a liar. Well, you know what? People have died for lies in history, but people don't die for a lie knowing it to be a lie. If it was a lie, Jesus would have known it. He wouldn't have died for the lie that he was holding up. Plus, all his apostles saw that he rose from the grave. They died martyrs' deaths proclaiming the truth. They clung to that truth. Well, if it wasn't true, they wouldn't have died for a lie. Nobody dies for a lie knowing it to be a lie. Another theory is that he's a lunatic, but yet Jesus shows no signs of lunacy, nor do his followers show any patterns of lunacy. The point is, Christianity is explainable. It's verifiable. It is undeniable. Therefore, it is true. Now, there are people that say all worldviews lead to the same God. Yet all worldviews are diametrically opposed to one another. And only one worldview passes the test of truth. And that is our belief in Jesus. He is explainable, and therefore the fact that Jesus is God is undeniable. Yet I've had extensive conversations with atheists. I've had extensive conversations with pantheists. And I have presented my logical arguments about how Jesus is God and is verifiable and how their beliefs are simply unexplainable. Yet, in their sincerity, they refuse to give up their false belief. See, it's hard to believe you're wrong when you have given so much of your time and resources to your wrong assumptions. Unfortunately, this is what makes evangelism difficult. The God of this world, it says, has blinded the eyes of the unbelieving, that they might not see the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ. Paul wrote that to the church at Corinth in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 4. The truth of who Jesus is and what he has accomplished can be clearly communicated. But the free will of someone to hold on to what they have sincerely believed in is hard to give up. The Bible's full of stories where God confronts through messengers false beliefs. And God verifies his existence and power, and people still reject God. Let me give you an example of that. An example in 1 Kings chapter 18 in your Old Testament. The godly prophet Elijah confronts the 450 prophets of Baal, who was the mythical fertility god. The evil king Ahab of the northern tribes of Israel sets up the duel between God and the prophets of Baal. Here's the rules of engagement. They're on top of the Mount Carmel. It's a mountain range in Israel. Each one of them, Elijah and the prophets of Baal, are to build an altar unto God. They're to set an ox on top of this altar that they build, and then they are to pray to their God to come and consume this offering. First up, the prophets of Baal. And they begin to chant morning through noon and even through midday. It's about 3 o'clock. Nothing's happened. Elijah's just set up a lawn chair, and he's just kind of mocking them. Maybe you guys need to cry a little louder. Maybe your God is asleep and can't hear you. 6, 7, 9 hours, nothing. Then it's Elijah's turn. Elijah takes his offering, and he builds a little moat around it, and he pours 40 gallons of water on top of his offering. Why would he pour water on top of an offering? Because water doesn't burn. And all of a sudden, in 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 38, Elijah prays, and instantly it says the Lord licked up the offering. But even in the midst of all this evidence, Queen Jezebel, Ahab's wife, didn't believe. Even when her sincere belief was proven wrong, she held on to her wrong belief. So there are stories where people didn't stop believing in their false belief, even when confronted with truth. But fortunately, there are stories of people giving up their false belief when confronted by truth. The Apostle Paul being one of the greatest examples. Paul would even say all the lies that he had previously built his life around, he says this, and it's biblical. He says it to the church at Philippi. He says they're excrement when compared to getting to know Jesus. The point is, we are commanded to share Jesus. We don't know who will give up their false belief and who will be persuaded. We're simply to share our faith and leave the results to God. This morning, I want to examine how Paul deals with people who are sincere in their beliefs, but they are sincerely wrong. We've been observing the book of Acts, and this morning we'll be observing Acts chapter 23, verses 12 through 35. Now, for the sake of time, I'm not going to read every single verse, but I'm going to do the best I can to represent what the scriptures are teaching. So first of all, let's look at verses 12 through 15 of chapter 23. It says this, "When it was day, the Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves under an oath, saying that they would neither eat nor drink until they had killed the Apostle Paul." They make an oath. They make a vow. They marry their conviction to kill Paul. Verse 13. There were more than 40 who formed this plot. There were 40 zealots who wanted to kill Paul and stop the evangelism of people coming to know Jesus. Verse 14. They came to the chief priests and the elders, the Sanhedrin basically, and said, "We bound ourselves under a solemn oath to taste nothing until we have killed Paul." Verse 15. "Now therefore, you and the council notify the commander to bring him down to you, as though you were going to determine his case by more through investigation. And we, for our part, are ready to slay him before he comes near the palace." Please, don't forget the context of what we're talking here. Paul has been rejected over and over and over again by the Jewish audience he has shared the gospel with in Jerusalem. The Romans are protecting Paul from the angry mob in Jerusalem. And alone in a cell where Paul is being held for his protection, all of a sudden, Jesus shows up in the cell. And the resurrected Jesus verifies the promise that he will never forsake his children. And he comes alongside Paul and he tells Paul to be of courage. He goes on, he says, "The message you have faithfully proclaimed in Jerusalem, you will be able to proclaim in Rome." God's promises give us courage to stay the course. Now, in that context, verses 12 through 15, there's 40 zealots for Judaism. They make this oath they will not eat until they have murdered Paul. They are sincere, but they are sincerely wrong in what they are doing. They even buy into the evil philosophy that lies are okay to use to get their desired results, which was Paul's death. The Jewish Sanhedrin are so blinded by their own sin, they are willing to be accomplices in the murder of Paul. They go for it. Let's invite Paul back for some more dialogue so that the 40 Jewish zealots can ambush him and kill him. They're breaking two of the major 10 commandments here. Don't lie and don't kill. And yet, they've rationalized it. It's okay. But you know what? God knows our plans in our bedroom. And the Holy Spirit has bugged our existence, and nothing is hidden from God. And God intercepts the evil plot. This is how God does it. In verses 16 through 22, I'm just going to read verse 16. Look at what it says. "But the son of Paul's sister heard of their ambush." He heard of this 40-man ambush. "And he came and entered the barracks and told Paul." The nephew of Paul is the informant. He tells Paul. Paul tells the Romans. The nephew tells the Roman commander, the 40 zealots, and all their plans. I want to show you where this is taking place. I want to show you this map. And I want you to see this map. You can see that this is kind of a layout of where we are here. We're in Jericho, no, we're not in Jericho, we're in Jerusalem. Now, where Paul is going to be taken to safety here in just a little bit, you're going to see he's going to be taken all the way up to Caesarea. Caesarea is the headquarters in the Middle East for the Romans. The Romans have kind of set up shop here. If you were to visit Israel today, you would fly into Tel Aviv, which is south of Caesarea. And the first place they take a tour group to is to Caesarea. Because this Caesarea up here, this is where you've got the remnants of all of the Roman influence during that time. This is where they set up a palace, they set up a headquarters. This was a protected Roman village for safekeeping. Now, Paul is under threat down here in Jerusalem. And so they realize that there's 40 guys that want to try to kill him here. So they're going to show here in just a second, they've got to transport him. And they got to transport him all the way up from Jerusalem all the way over to Caesarea. Now, I want you to see this town right here. We're going to refer to it in a little bit. It's called Antipatris. I have no idea. Maybe it means against Patras. But Antipatris is this town. Now, I'm going to delve into this, but from Jerusalem to Antipatris, it's a very single road, and it's kind of like to get from Jerusalem to Antipatris, you've got to go through all of these kind of crevices in this mountain range. It's a great place for somebody to be ambushed on the road from Jerusalem to Antipatris. That gives you a little bit of context. Now remember, Paul, even though not popular with the Romans, is still a Roman citizen. Therefore, he has the right to be protected. Now remember, God has promised Paul that he will be his witness in Rome, that no murderous plot will succeed until God's promise is fulfilled. Now let me ask you a fair question. For Paul and the Pauls of the world, why stick with the truth of the gospel if it costs us personally this much? I mean, when you look at the Apostle Paul's life, he stood up for the gospel of Jesus Christ, and everywhere he goes, he's being persecuted. And let's go back to our founder, Jesus. They killed him. Now, why in the world was this thing called Christianity? Why would you not give it up if it costs you so much personally? Well, I have 3 reasons. It is always worth it personally to stand up with Jesus so we ourselves don't wander. The second reason to stand up for Christ is some people will repent and be led to truth. Paul is an example of that. Some people will walk away from their sincerely wrong beliefs they've held to for so long. And third, it will be a matter in eternity. It will matter in eternity who we stand up for in the here and now. I'm reminded of C.T. Studd, the famous British wealthy cricket player who gave up his life to go on the mission field. And he said these words, "Only one life 'twill soon be past. Only what's done for Christ will last." In other words, the cost of following Jesus is and will forever be worth it. Now I want you to see what the commander of the Roman cohort does. He hears that Paul is going to be ambushed by this army of 40 zealots who want to kill Paul, who want to use the Sanhedrin in their deception. So we pick it up in verse 23 and 24. And he called to him 2 of the centurions and said, "Get 200 soldiers ready for the 3rd hour. And proceed to Caesarea with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen. They were also to provide mounts, horses, to put Paul on and bring Paul to safely into Felix the governor." So this Roman commander, he has 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and another 200 expert spear throwers. So 470 Roman soldiers. It's a small army. He also says, let's get Paul some horses so that he can ride on the journey. The commander is going to transport Paul from Jerusalem to Caesarea, which we saw was on the coast of Israel. About 40-mile journey. Well, the Roman governor, who is the governor of this entire area, Caesarea, the headquarters of this area. What strikes me is how God can use a non-believing secular agency to accomplish his purposes. The world is God's footstool. Rome is being used by God to keep Paul alive. Now, I want you to observe the lengths that the Romans go to protect Paul. 470 trained soldiers, a small army to protect Paul against these guys with sticks and spears and stones, an army of 40. Everybody knows the best offense is a good defense. So why in the world would 40 zealots even attempt to ambush Paul here? The Roman army is scaring a cockroach with a bazooka. Why? Because God is in the heavens and he does as he pleases. God makes sure his promises come to fruition. No force can usurp God's promises. So the commander responsible for the 470 and the safe transport of Paul from Jerusalem to Caesarea writes a letter to his boss, the governor of the area, Felix, in verses 25 through 30. We even get the commander's name here in verse 26, but in verse 25 it says, he wrote a letter having this form. This commander, his name is Claudius Lysias. So Claudius Lysias, to the most excellent governor Felix, greetings. Sounds like he's brown-nosing. To his most excellent governor. Verse 27, when this man was arrested, this Paul was arrested by the Jews and was about to be slain by them, I came up to them with the troops and rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman. Verse 28, and wanting to ascertain the charge for which they were accusing him, I brought him down to their council. Brought him down to the Sanhedrin in verse 29. And I found him to be accused over questions about their law. But I want you to get this, don't miss this, but under no accusation deserving death or imprisonment. Verse 30, when I was informed that there would be a plot against him, I sent him to you at once, also instructing his accusers to bring charges against him before you. So Claudius Lysias writes a detailed note to Felix, so that Felix would know exactly why Paul was being transported to Caesarea. Paul was taken into custody by us because he's a Roman. And the Jews want to kill him. This 40-person strong group of zealots plotted to kill him. And then Lysias writes a very important phrase in verse 29. Please don't miss it. Lysias found no grounds for Paul's death or imprisonment. It's as if he's saying he is innocent of criminal activity. Now, this is very similar to the same statement that Pontius Pilate said about Jesus in Luke chapter 23, verses 14 and 15. Remember, Pilate to the chief priests said, I nor Herod have found any grounds that deserve Jesus' death. I have found no guilt in Jesus. So here, Paul proclaimed not guilty by Lysias, the Roman commander. 25 years earlier, Jesus proclaimed not guilty by Pilate, the Roman governor. Now, why is this observation important? Because being a follower of the one true God is the only belief that will cause people to punish Christians in spite of the fact Christ is not guilty, which verifies that any persecution of Jesus is a mark of pure evil born in the mind of the evil one himself. When you consider in history, it's true that evil belief systems have been killed by other evil belief systems. But the persecution of Jesus is the only belief system that can claim true innocence, because Jesus is without sin. And when Christ is persecuted, it is unjustified and evil. All other man-made beliefs fall under the umbrella of no one is truly good, no, not one, that Paul said to the Romans in chapter 3, verses 10 through 12. I want you to now observe verse 31 and 32. So the soldiers, in accordance with their orders, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. We saw that city. We'll look at it again. But the next day, leaving the horsemen to go on with him, they returned to the barracks. Well, what is this verse 31 and 32 all about? I believe the scriptures give us details that sometimes we don't deserve, that skeptics can't play with us the gotcha card. When Scripture is accurately examined, there is no room to be got. Let me show you what I mean here. I want to show you that map again. And when you see this map, and I want you to see, he goes from Jerusalem to Antipatris. He's got 470 soldiers with him. The reason he sends 470 soldiers is because it is a snake path. There are crevices all around him. And there are places that, let's say, a band of about 40 could ambush the Apostle Paul. So he surrounds him with 470. Once they get to Antipatris, from Antipatris to Caesarea, it's just basically the coastal wide open plains. And so Lysias says, you know what, we don't need all 470. So he withdraws 200 to go back to Jerusalem, and now he says, okay, now we've got 200 spearmen and we've got 70 horsemen to take him all the way from Antipatris all the way to Caesarea. It's so practical. When you're wide out in the open, you can't be crept up on. Nobody can sneak up to somebody when it's just wide open plain. So the thing that catches me in this is, after going through this, God is so practical. You know, it's like the Bible makes sense and it's so practical. And so it's like God knows exactly what he's doing. There's no gotcha here. God knows exactly what he's doing and the best way to protect somebody. Now I want you to observation. Keep in mind, 40 zealots. Their objective, what did they want to do? They wanted to murder Paul. 40 zealots wanted to murder Paul. They failed. Now, does that mean they went on to starve to death? Because you remember, they made an oath that said, we will not eat food until we kill Paul. Well, they failed. They never killed Paul. Does that mean they went on to starve, wanting to be true to their vow? I don't think so. See, a vow that's based upon a faulty belief system is unsustainable. A vow based on truth is worth sustaining because it is based on the certainty of God's promises. For instance, your marriage vow is worth sustaining because marriage is designed to tell the truth about God. Your vow to Jesus, when you said, I place my life in Jesus' hands, I commit my life to Jesus. Well, that vow to Jesus is worth sustaining because of Jesus' promise that he will never leave you. But a vow not to eat until you murder, well, that's unsustainable. And I would venture to say when Paul was out of sight, they probably turned to one another and said, pass the chips and salsa. We're not going to stop eating here. Now, again, no time to read it, but in verse 33 through 35, Paul is delivered to Caesarea, to Felix. Let me take you back to something that's kind of fun. When Paul came to know the Lord on a road to Damascus, it's recorded in Acts chapter 9, verse 15. And in Acts chapter 9, verse 15, it said, you know what? When he came to know Jesus Christ, there was a prophecy about him. It's recorded in chapter 9, verse 15, that kings will bow down to him, that he will be able to persuade kings. Well, Felix is the governor of the entire area. This may be part of that fulfillment. Paul would remain here in Caesarea for 2 years. Later, he would be transported to Rome, just like Jesus promised. For Paul, he had experienced plenty in his life, but he'd also experienced being destitute. He had been free, but he'd also been in prison. And whether on the road or in a jail cell, Paul would write to the church at Philippi and say these words, I have learned to be content in all situations. Now, why is he content in all situations? Because he understood was no accident. Where God planted him, that was his current assignment. There was a mentor friend of mine, his name was Jerry Wonder. And this was 25 years ago, but this story marked me. I remember Jerry at the time, he had girls that were in high school. And one of Jerry's girls was a junior in high school, and she ran track and field. She was a hurdler. She ran, like the women's 100-meter low hurdles. And he used to love to go to the track meet and watch his daughter run the hurdles. And his favorite part was watching her cross the finish line. On this particular occasion, they went to a track meet, and the track was very hard. And her starting blocks have spikes on them, and the spikes on the starting blocks would not sink into the track. And so before the race, Jerry's daughter said, "Hey, Dad, would you stand on the back of my starting blocks so that when the race goes off, the starting blocks won't slip?" And so Jerry, of course, it's like, "Hey, you're going to acknowledge my existence as a high school girl? Sure, I'll do what you want me to do." So he's standing on the back of her starting blocks. The race goes off. And then he realizes he won't be there to see his favorite part of the race, which is when his daughter crossed the finish line. But then it dawned on him. He said, "You know what? That's our task as a parent, but it's also our task as a Christian, that we are sending messages to places we will never go." For Paul, wherever he was planted, whether he was in prison or whether he was on the road, he realized ministry was about sending messages to places he would never physically go. When I come up here on a Sunday morning, and I've prepared all week to give you some nuggets of truth, I realize the impact is not only with the 600 people who are gathered here in this room, but the impact is that maybe you'll take a principle I share and you'll take it into your boardroom. You'll take it into your office. You'll take it into your classroom. You'll take it where you will go that I will never have an opportunity to go to. That's the task of a messenger, is that we are sending messages to places we will never go. So it doesn't matter if you're in prison or if you're on a post someplace in the open. You are sending messages to places you will never go. Why be faithful where God has assigned you? Well, for the simple reason to help people who are sincerely wrong about Jesus to become people who are sincerely right about Jesus. Not everyone will give up their wrong belief, but many will.